Welcome to As Long as the River Flows, a Keepers of the Water podcast. Episode 14, Part 2, Water Knows No Boundaries, Releasing Toxic Tailings Ponds Won't Either, was created by a webinar previously recorded on October the 4th of 2022. Join Keepers of the Water and Environmental Defense as they dive into the alarming findings of their report, which map decades of the toxic takeover of Indigenous territories by tailings ponds, massive reservoirs of oil sands wastewater. In Part 2, Jesse starts off by giving the audience some background into tailings ponds and the devastating effects on the environment. Then Daniel, a resident of Fort Good Hope and a retired lawyer, speaks on the tailings ponds and the idea of controlled release of these tailings into the Athabasca River.
I'm not sure where the audience is at for understanding about the tar sands, as we call it. Some people call it the oil sands or the tailings ponds. So the tar sands are located in northeast, what's colonially known as Alberta and Treaty 8 territory. It is the biggest industrial project on the planet, and we've even found the references to back that up, so we can provide those for you either this evening or tomorrow to reach out to you. It's massive. The reason why we call it the tar sands is because they're not extracting oil, they're extracting bitumen. It was the conventional oil was what it was called to begin with, because back in the 50s, they discovered this oil, but Indigenous people knew that this tar substance was here, and they used it for how they needed it, but it was living in harmony with the land. So it was never seen as something that needed to be massively extracted out to sustain this existence that we have, which isn't even sustainable anyway. And so Indigenous people knew about this, and the people up there, we used it for the purposes that we needed it for. And then in the 50s, with the evolution of science and all of these things, they discovered that they can extract this bitumen. Back then, it was easy to extract because it was on the surface. So they used this technology that was created. And the thing is they're still using a lot of that old technology today. That's one concern, is that the technology is, their extraction technology is still like it's outdated. And our science guy says it's like a T model Ford or something, and we should be on like smart cars. And so that was called conventional oil. That's all gone. So what they're extracting right now, our conventional bitumen, is unconventional, because it's all of the stuff that was easy to get out, that's all gone. So whatever, they're digging deeper and deeper through steam assisted gravity. Like, they have other technologies that they're using in combination with the really old technology. And they're just massively extracting, and it's getting harder and harder and deeper. And the cumulative impacts are just massive. So this is in the boreal forest. There's a few concerns with that. Well, there's a lot of concerns with that, but the boreal forest is the lungs. So they say like the boreal forest and the Amazon forest, those are the lungs of the planet. They keep the planet alive. We need to have a healthy boreal forest for so many reasons, but one of the main reasons is that it absorbs carbon, and it's just such diverse ecosystems in the boreal forest, and the boreal forest retains water. It's just, you may not understand. So if people are living in a city or they're far removed, maybe even on the other side of the world, like, why should I care what happens in northern Alberta and the boreal forest? It affects you, because if we have a healthy boreal forest in what's called northern Alberta in Canada, the other side of the world is going to be healthy. And so that's part of, so we call it the tar sands because it's bitumen. So they're extracting this really heavy substance that they have to ship away, and then that gets processed to become oil. With that, and I just want to speak really quickly because I know that I only have like a minute, then I'm going to pass it to Daniel, is the cumulative impacts. I want to talk about that really quickly. So they have massive deforestation. So it's not only extracting of bitumen, it's creating all these roads, clear cutting forests. They're draining wetlands. Wetlands, again, help retain water. They help clean the planet. They help capture carbon. carbon emissions. And once wetlands are destroyed, that's it. You cannot recreate wetlands. There's science studies. They've been trying to, recreate wetlands, and they haven't been able to. And the animals and the plants, and I always think of the animals because they know their roots, right? So it's like when you come home, it's like you go to work and you know your route, and then you come home and then you like eat, and that's your safe place. That's where you relax. It's the same thing with animals. They have routes that they follow. So it's like the beaver, the deer, the muskrat, they all have their places that they go. And I just think sometimes, because when you drive up in our communities and you see this clear cutting happen, and you just imagine like these living beings, and they go for a little while and then they come home and it's gone. What they must feel like and what that must be like for them. And, and especially like the ones with the babies in springtime, like springtime is, it's our new year as Indigenous people. And that's when all the life is happening. So imagine all of the living beings with all their babies, like the ducks, the geese, the bears, everybody has babies and they're out on the land, and these are the kinds of things that we think about it, and we're trying to have people understand like these are major issues, but there's like a whole other world out there other than us. And so with the tailings, what I want to get back to what Ali mentioned. So these are poisonous. They can be seen from outer space. They're massive. Anything that lands on them will die. We have had tar sands healing walks. If you Google tar sands healing walk, you'll find, the stories about the healing walks. We do a loop around the tar sands, because sometimes if you don't see it, you can't really understand how destructive this is to the land. And we do this 14-kilometer walk around the tar sands. And you can see places that look like desert. You can hear gunshots. And the gunshots are mimicking, they're not real gunshots, but they sound like gunshots. And it's meant to try keep the wildlife away from these tailings ponds, because if anything ingests it, like they're going to die. You see all of this pollution, like these emissions coming out. And there is a First Nation community smack dab called Fort McKay around all of these industrial plants. It's really surreal when you drive up to Fort McKay, and this is what the kids are growing up with. That's when Ali talks about environmental racism. That's perfect example of environmental racism. Imagine a little 8-year-old girl or boy, and they're driving every day, and they're driving through that. That's their backyard. It's really disturbing and it's sickening. And so with these tailings ponds, the Alberta government and the industry, they want to start dumping them into the Athabasca River. And they're saying, we found a way to treat them and it's just like water, and we're going to start dumping them. And when we found that out in 2019, as Keepers of the Water, we're like, what? This is insane, and we have a hard stance. There is no dumping of any tailings into the Athabasca River. And so what we're saying is, if you can treat these tailings to be like water, then you take that and you keep reusing it, because they say that they recycle and that they have these great recycling systems. So they already have the recycling systems in place in their extraction process. So they don't need to, and I always say it will become from one of the most destructive projects on the planet to one of the most efficient, because they won't be using any fresh water. They use, I think it's like 6 barrels of fresh water to extract 1 barrel of bitumen. So they're taking massive amounts. That's another thing when we talk about cumulative impacts, and I'll wrap it up right quick. They use a lot of fresh water. And so they won't have to take any water, and they won't have to dump any poison in the water. So we're really calling them out to say, we want to see your science, because there's been no independent science to show us that what you're even saying is actually true. And there's a lot of legal implications. And that's where Daniel comes in. So Daniel Theseli, I'll introduce you. He's been working with Keepers of the Water. He's Dene, he hunts moose. He's a non-practicing lawyer. He's on the land, and he's been an amazing part of our team, because, he also knows Indigenous law. And that's where we're going as Indigenous people. It's like, get us out of these corrupt, oppressive colonial legal systems and let us govern the land the way we're intended to. So I'll pass it over to Daniel to continue this conversation about why, the tailings are harmful and why dumping of the tailings will be what I'm calling international human rights crime.
Thanks, Jesse. Hi, everybody. I'm Daniel Taselli. I'm Dene from Fort Good Hope, which is a small isolated community just south of the Arctic Circle on the banks of the big river. They call it the Mackenzie River on the map. So tailings is an issue for us because we are downstream from the tailings ponds. We're very far downstream, but we still have to worry about the cumulative effects of any tailings leak or release, along with the myriad other contaminant sources that make their way into the water here, which we do drink. This is the water source for the community. And it's kind of a main highway for Dene up here because travel is so difficult with a very short winter road season. I am a retired lawyer. I used to be a lawyer. I don't like doing that. Now I do other things that I enjoy, like working on Indigenous rights and environmental justice. But I want to zero in on the issue that we've been raising and that has really gotten a lot of attention from Dene this far downstream. And that is this issue of the proposed release of what they're calling treated tailings via regulations under Canada's Fisheries Act. Canada has a Fisheries Act, and that's the federal government of Canada. And that prohibits the dumping of what they call deleterious substances into any fish-bearing water. And that means any substance that could be poisonous to fish. So it includes tailings. It is illegal to put that into any fish-bearing water unless there is specific authorization to do so via regulations under that Federal Fisheries Act. Because most things that are related to these massive industrial activities are under the jurisdiction legally of provinces, there's been very little that people who do not have leverage with the provincial government of Alberta can do to impact the kind of trajectory of these tailings ponds and all of the related infrastructure and destruction of the boreal forest. The Fisheries Act is one of those areas where people everywhere who have some leverage with Canada's federal government are allegedly supposed to have a voice that can somehow protect this massive, pristine, and fragile watershed and ecosystem that empties into the Arctic Ocean. And the proposal on the table from Canada's federal government now is to effectively remove that protection and introduce these regulations that would allow for the release of these treated tailings into the Athabasca River. I'm not sure if it was mentioned, but these treated tailings are still high in naphthenic acids and in salinity. So although they're treated, they are still toxic. And it is an issue for downstream communities and for the ecosystems. This has gained some attention up here further north. And in July of this year, the Dene Nation, which is a political organization representing Dene and advocating on the rights for Dene. At the Dene Nation Assembly in July, the chiefs passed a resolution that outright opposes the introduction of these Fisheries Act regulations and also calls on Canada to undertake a process to seek the free, prior, and informed consent of downstream Dene as a requirement, as a legal requirement before they introduce these regulations. And I want to talk about that very briefly because I think that's a perspective that is shifting. And I think we're going to see that be more prevalent in the discussion about these proposed Fisheries Act changes. We're dealing with colonial legal system that is really premised on values and doctrines that are centuries old and that are effectively outdated now. And the direction that international law is moving when it comes to the rights of Indigenous people is that international law is starting to recognize Indigenous people's rights to self-determination, to autonomy or self-government, to recognition and preservation of cultural identity, rights to traditional land and natural resources, and that includes restitution for lands that have been lost or stolen, rights to reparation and redress for wrongs that have been suffered at the hands of colonial governments and nations, and the rights to have treaties and agreements that were fairly negotiated be upheld and honored by the state. So this is the direction that international law is moving in. And a common thread that kind of weaves through a lot of these distinct rights that Indigenous peoples have under international law is free, prior, and informed consent. And what that means is that when the state is proposing some type of action or activity that would have significant impacts on the rights of Indigenous peoples, then the state needs to undertake a process to get the consent of those Indigenous peoples before it can move ahead. In this process, the consent needs to be free in the sense that it's not coerced and that there's no bullying or issues of duress involved in gaining that consent. The consent needs to be prior in the sense that it is given before the state actually moves ahead with the action, so that the consent is actually meaningful and not just a box that they're checking. And the consent needs to be informed. And that means that Indigenous people need to have access to all of the information that's needed to understand the issue and make a decision. And they also need to have the time and resources available to them to go through that information in order to make that decision. And in cases where the potential for an impact to rights is severe, then the way international law is moving is that consent is a requirement. It is not just a process. If the government does not obtain the consent of impacted Indigenous people, they cannot proceed with the proposed activity. And again, this is new evolutions in international law and Canada's legal system, things like Section 35 and the jurisprudence that has kind of been developed under that are not recognizing this yet. And I think we're going to see this discussion start coming more to the forefront on issues like this tailings release issue and the proposed regulations under the Fisheries Act. And that is a direction that Dene up here are starting to take when we're pushing back on Canada's federal government with this proposal. So I will leave it at that.
That was Daniel Tuselli, and thank you for listening. Don't forget to download and subscribe to the podcast to be the first to hear new episodes. If you would like to donate to the cause or find out more information on Keepers of the Water, visit keepersofthewater.ca. If you would like to hear the complete webinar, visit the Keepers of the Water Facebook page or the Keepers of the Water YouTube channel. Miigwech.